A cold silence settled over the gym, broken only by the rhythmic hum of treadmills and the dull clatter of weights. She stood near the back, her headphones resting around her neck, her breathing calm. Just a normal day, until it wasn't. A uniformed officer pushed open the glass doors. The sharp sound of his boots echoed like a warning. His presence felt deliberate, like a predator hunting prey, even though no one else seemed to notice. His eyes found her, and he made a beeline toward her with purpose. The air shifted. Her instincts kicked in, but she remained still. "Hey," his voice boomed over the low music, interrupting the hum of the machines. She turned, calmly meeting his glare. "Is there a problem?" "Yeah, there's a problem." His smirk was condescending, like he had already won a game she hadn't agreed to play. "We got a call about someone acting suspicious. Care to explain why you're here?" Her brows furrowed. "Acting suspicious? You heard me. You don't look like you belong here." The emphasis stung like a slap across the face. The gym was full, men and women of all kinds, moving about as if they were invisible. Yet somehow, only she was suspicious. Her skin burned with a heat she tried to suppress. "I'm just working out, like everyone else." The officer stepped closer, towering over her. "Don't get smart with me." "I'm not," she said sharply. "But I don't owe you an explanation for being here. I haven't done anything. You think this is a debate?" His voice lowered to a hiss. "Listen, sweetheart. I don't know who you think you are, but people like you don't talk back to people like me. People like you." The words lodged themselves in her throat like shards of glass. Around them, people started to glance nervously at the growing scene. She saw it, the subtle way some turned their backs, how others pretended not to see, hoping to avoid being dragged in. She knew this moment too well. Humiliation was an old, unwanted friend. She took a slow breath and straightened her spine. "Are you accusing me of something? Because if not, I'd like to finish my workout." The officer's smirk vanished, replaced by something darker, uglier. His hand shot out, jabbing a finger toward her chest. "You think you're untouchable. Don't touch me," she warned, her voice steady, though her hands curled into fists at her sides. "You're lucky I don't haul you in right now for resisting." "Resisting what?" Her voice cut through his. "Your ego." That was it. The final straw. The officer's expression twisted into something animalistic, no longer hiding the contempt behind his badge. Before she could step back, his fist collided with her face. The sound echoed through the gym, a sickening crack that froze everyone in place. She stumbled, her vision blurring, as gasps rang out around her. Silence fell again, heavier than before. Someone muttered, "Did he just hit her?" The officer stood over her, chest heaving as if daring anyone to challenge him. She was being aggressive, he barked, looking around for validation. Some nodded hesitantly, compliance born of fear. Others turned away entirely, unwilling to intervene. She pressed a hand to her face, feeling the warm trickle of blood near her lip. Slowly, she pushed herself to her feet. When she met his gaze again, her eyes were like steel, shining with anger and something far more dangerous, purpose. "You're going to regret that," she said, her voice low but unshakable. The officer scoffed. "What did you just say?" "You heard me." He laughed, short and sharp. "What are you going to do? File a complaint? Good luck with that." He gestured to the badge on his chest, his voice dripping with arrogance. "This protects me. You're nobody. Nobody." That word echoed in her mind as she stared him down, her breathing slow and deliberate. The officer turned his back, confident that he'd won. The crowd began to disperse, whispers filling the air like smoke. But he had no idea. Tomorrow, the entire city would know exactly who she was. Because the person he had just punched in front of a dozen silent witnesses wasn't just another name he could bury under paperwork. No, she was something far more dangerous to a man like him. Tomorrow, he'd walk into his precinct, smug and untouchable, only to find out that the department's new chief of police was the very woman he'd tried to break. And when the truth unraveled, when the cameras rolled, and the evidence surfaced, what happened next would leave him unrecognizable, his name plastered across every headline, his arrogance crumbling in the face of justice. But the real question is, what would she do when the power was finally in her hands? Would she destroy him the way he tried to destroy her? Or would she teach him a lesson so profound it echoed through every man who thought their badge was a shield against consequences? One thing was certain, the officer had no idea how far she would go to turn this moment of humiliation into a reckoning. And the city would never forget it. Before we dive into today's powerful story, I want to take a moment to send a heartfelt message to our Black viewers. At Plow of Twist, we stand firmly against all forms of racism, prejudice, and injustice. We believe in respect, equality, and using storytelling to shed light on important issues. You are valued, you are seen, and your experiences matter deeply. Now, sit back and enjoy this emotional and impactful narrative. If you haven't yet, subscribe to the channel so you don't miss the twists and turns we bring every week. Let's get into the story. The air in the precinct was thick with the usual sounds, phones ringing, the hum of printers spitting out endless reports, and the low murmur of conversations that held the weight of crime, politics, and mundane bureaucracy. Detectives shuffled papers at their desks, officers leaned back in chairs exchanging stories of their beats, and the worn smell of coffee hung in the air like a permanent fixture. It was a place of controlled chaos, where authority was both a responsibility and a weapon, depending on who held it. In the midst of this rhythm, Marissa Bennett walked briskly through the entrance of the downtown precinct, her polished heels striking the tile with a sharp, unwavering cadence. She moved with purpose, her posture erect and controlled. Dressed in a tailored black pantsuit, her presence commanded attention without a word. Marissa wasn't tall, but there was something about her stature, the sharpness of her gaze, the quiet confidence in her movements, that made her seem larger than life. People paused, if only for a second, as she passed. She was no stranger to these halls, though she'd spent years away from them. As she moved, memories flashed unbidden, of days when she wore a uniform just like the officers around her now. Days when her job was to prove herself over and over again, not just as a rookie cop, but as a black woman in law enforcement. Marissa had learned young that silence could be more powerful than shouting. When they doubted her, she showed them. When they dismissed her, she worked harder. And when they underestimated her, she let her actions speak for themselves. Now, after years of climbing the ranks in neighboring precincts, her reputation as a fair but fierce leader had earned her the title of Chief of Police, the first black woman to hold the position in the city's history. It was a milestone Marissa carried like armor, but it wasn't lost on her that her achievement also made her a target. She knew how many eyes were on her. She knew how many people were waiting to see if she would fail. As she rounded a corner, a soft voice broke her thoughts. "Good morning, Chief Bennett." Marissa turned, her expression softening at the sight of Alyssa Torres, her new assistant, a young woman with dark curls that bounced as she moved and a perpetual look of quiet efficiency. Alyssa was sharp, ambitious, and, like Marissa, often overlooked until she spoke up. "Morning, Alyssa. How's the chaos looking today?" Alyssa offered a small smile as she handed over a neatly prepared folder. "Same as always. I've scheduled a briefing with the captains in an hour. Also, there's some pushback on the community initiative proposal. A few officers are hesitant." Marissa's brow lifted as she flipped through the folder. She'd expected resistance. Change never came easy, especially not in an institution like this. Noted. "Anything else?" Alyssa hesitated. "The officer involved in the gym incident yesterday, his name is Officer Travis Miller. I've compiled the preliminary report, but there's no real action yet. You may want to take a look yourself. For the first time that morning, Marissa's steps slowed. The gym. The incident. That incident. The one she had lived, not as Chief Bennett, but as a woman whose dignity had been stomped on without a second thought. Her lips still ached faintly at the memory, though the swelling had faded. "Thank you, Alyssa," she said quietly. "Officer Travis Miller." The name echoed in her mind. Marissa knew men like him. Men who wore the badge like it was a crown and not a promise to serve. Men who believed their authority placed them above accountability. Miller was a name whispered in complaint rooms, his record speckled with minor offenses that had been brushed aside over the years. He was one of those officers who walked a thin line, never blatant enough to face consequences, but bold enough to remind everyone of his presence. And yesterday, in the gym, he had crossed that line. Marissa hadn't gone there as chief of police. She'd gone as herself, someone who valued a quiet workout after long days of battling policies and procedures. She hadn't expected to be cornered, humiliated, and ultimately assaulted by a man she'd soon be overseeing. And he hadn't known who she was. Not then. She'd seen it in his face, the unchecked arrogance, the unshakable belief that his badge made him untouchable. And maybe, in another life, he would have gotten away with it. Maybe his report would have claimed she'd been aggressive, disrespectful, words weaponized against people who looked like her every day. But this wasn't another life. This was hers. Marissa closed the folder and turned to Alyssa. "Make sure Miller's file is on my desk after the briefing." "Yes, ma'am." She continued down the hall, her expression unreadable as officers nodded politely, their voices dropping to whispers once she passed. A few of them already knew what had happened. Rumors spread quickly in places like this, but none of them dared say it out loud. It was too raw, too uncharted. The idea that someone like Travis Miller could have done what he did to the new chief of police was a scandal waiting to explode. Meanwhile, across the precinct, Officer Travis Miller sat at his desk, his fingers idly drumming against the wood. He was tall, broad-shouldered, with blonde hair cut short and a square jaw that might have been handsome if not for the perpetual scowl that marred his features. To his colleagues, Miller was known for being tough. To those who worked under him, he was something else entirely. He was the kind of officer who enjoyed power a little too much, whose words often carried the sharp edge of a threat disguised as a joke. And as he sat there, scrolling lazily through his phone, Miller had no idea what was coming. A few desks over, Detective Marcus Green, a seasoned officer with salt and pepper hair and a quiet demeanor, watched Miller with a measured gaze. Marcus had been around long enough to know when trouble was brewing. He'd heard about the gym incident, though Miller had laughed it off as nothing more than putting someone in their place. Marcus had seen officers like him before, men who mistook fear for respect, who saw accountability as an attack. Marcus's phone buzzed, pulling him from his thoughts. A notification flashed across the screen, briefing with Chief Bennett in 15 minutes. Mandatory attendance. He glanced at Miller, who was still smirking at something on his phone, and exhaled heavily. Trouble was definitely brewing. As the briefing room began to fill, the hum of conversation grew louder. Officers exchanged looks and muttered questions. What would she say? What was this about? And why was the tension suddenly so thick? When Marissa entered, the room fell silent. She stood at the front, her gaze sweeping over the faces in front of her. Some stared back defiantly. Others avoided her eyes. Miller sat toward the middle, slouched in his chair, his smirk firmly in place. Marissa took her time, letting the silence stretch. Then, finally, she spoke. Yesterday, an officer of this precinct overstepped his authority. The room shifted uncomfortably. Miller's smirk faltered, just slightly. And that officer thought there would be no consequences. He thought he was untouchable. Her gaze landed on Miller. His face hardened, his confidence cracking just enough for her to see it. But let me make something very clear, Marissa continued, her voice even but sharp. There are consequences. There is accountability. And no one in this department is above it. The room was silent. No one moved. Marissa stepped forward, her voice dropping to a low, deliberate tone. We are here to serve and protect. All of us. And if you can't respect that responsibility, you don't belong here. Across the room, Miller's jaw tightened, his knuckles white as he gripped the arms of his chair. He didn't know it yet, but his world was already unraveling. And this was just the beginning. The morning sun cast long shadows across the precinct's entrance, where Marissa Bennett's black SUV rolled to a quiet stop. Her hands gripped the steering wheel as she stared at the building she now led. The weight of leadership was familiar, Marissa had spent years preparing for it, but today was different. Today, she wasn't just a leader, she was a woman with unfinished business. And unfinished business had a way of unraveling everything. Inside, the precinct buzzed with restrained energy. Officers moved through the hallways, exchanging murmurs as they passed one another. Word of the chief's morning speech had spread like wildfire. Some applauded her stance on accountability, seeing it as a necessary shift for the department. Others grumbled quietly, uneasy with the idea that no one, not even them, was above scrutiny. And then there were men like Travis Miller, men whose confidence was their armor, whose egos thrived in unchecked silence. In the locker room, Miller leaned against a row of metal lockers, his shirt half-buttoned, his badge gleaming under the flickering fluorescent lights. He smirked at his reflection, straightening his collar as he listened to a group of younger officers murmuring near the benches. "You hear what she said?" one of them, Officer Cartwright, muttered, shaking his head. "Sounds like she's gunning for someone." "Gunning for all of us," another added. "What does she think this is? A daycare?" Miller chuckled, a low, condescending sound that made the others turn toward him. "Relax, boys," he said, pushing off the lockers. "She'll make her little speech, shake a few feathers, and when the dust settles, nothing will change." "They never change." Cartwright frowned. "You don't know that, Miller." They say, Miller interrupted, his voice dripping with mockery. "What do they know? I've been here longer than half these rookies. You think she's gonna take me down?" He scoffed, slamming his locker shut. "I've handled worse." But even as the words left his mouth, Miller felt the tension prickling the back of his neck. Something about this felt different. For the first time, there was an enemy he couldn't laugh off or push aside. It made his temper flare. It made him reckless. Outside the locker room, Detective Marcus Green leaned against the doorframe, unnoticed. He hadn't missed a word of Miller's bravado, but his expression remained unreadable. Marcus had seen Miller's type plenty of times before, men who mistook fear for respect and arrogance for strength. Marcus shook his head slightly before turning on his heel. He had somewhere else to be. Marissa sat at the head of the long conference table, a stack of files spread neatly in front of her. Across from her sat Marcus Green, his expression calm and steady. A steaming cup of black coffee sat untouched in front of him. "Travis Miller," Marissa said, her voice carefully neutral as she flipped open the file. "Talk to me." Marcus leaned back in his chair, folding his hands over his stomach. "He's been here 10 years, he began. One of those guys who knows how to toe the line. He's got a few red flags, use of unnecessary force complaints, verbal intimidation, harassment claims. Nothing that ever made it to IA. Why not?" Marcus shrugged. "Victims back down. Witnesses change their stories. You know how it works." Marissa did know. She'd seen it play out 100 times over her career. Officers like Miller thrived in the margins, never stepping far enough out of line to face real consequences. But yesterday, he had crossed that line. She flipped to another page in the file, her jaw tightening. "He didn't recognize me, Marcus. He had no idea who I was. Marcus studied her carefully. And that bothers you? What bothers me is that he didn't think twice. I wasn't a person to him. I was an obstacle. Something to be dismissed or controlled. Marcus nodded slowly. What are you thinking? Marissa's gaze sharpened as she closed the file. I'm thinking it's time he learned what accountability looks like. Marcus allowed himself a small smile. I figured as much. The tension in the precinct rose steadily over the next few days. Marissa moved with quiet precision, watching, listening, waiting. She called department-wide meetings on policy, held private discussions with captains, and spoke to officers one-on-one. Some responded positively, eager for the change she promised. Others, like Miller, stewed in silence, their resentment simmering beneath forced smiles and polite nods. In the break room, Miller slouched in a chair, his arms crossed as he watched his colleagues talk in low voices. Word had gotten around that Chief Bennett had requested to personally review every single use of force complaint filed over the last 5 years. Miller's name was on more than one. What's her endgame? Cartwright asked, sitting across from him, his voice low. Miller didn't answer right away. His jaw was tight, his gaze fixed on the table. Finally, he spoke. She wants a scapegoat. She's making an example out of me. Maybe you shouldn't have, don't, Miller snapped, cutting Cartwright off. His voice was sharp, but underneath it was something else, fear. He wouldn't say it out loud, but Miller could feel the walls closing in. Everywhere he turned, there were whispers. Officers who used to laugh at his jokes avoided him now. Detectives who once let him slide gave him cold, assessing looks. It was as though the entire department was holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. And then it did. Marissa sat in her office, staring at the security footage playing on her laptop. The gym incident unfolded in stark clarity, Miller's aggressive posture, his jabbed finger, his strike. Marissa watched herself stumble, saw the way the other patrons froze in shock. Her blood ran cold as she relived that moment, but she didn't look away. This was the proof she needed, the undeniable truth. Her intercom buzzed, breaking her focus. Alyssa's voice filtered through the speaker. Chief, Officer Miller is here. He says you wanted to see him. Marissa took a slow breath, centering herself. Send him in. The door opened, and Miller stepped inside, his posture stiff. He looked at her with a mix of defiance and caution, as though trying to decide which version of himself he needed to be. You wanted to see me, Chief? Marissa gestured to the chair across from her desk. Have a seat, Officer Miller. Miller hesitated before lowering himself into the chair. What's this about? Marissa folded her hands on the desk, meeting his gaze evenly. I think you already know. Miller's smirk faltered. Is this about that gym thing? Look, I told you, I handled it. You handled it? Marissa's voice was soft, but the edge beneath it was unmistakable. Is that what you call assaulting a citizen in broad daylight? Miller's jaw tightened. She was being aggressive. I wasn't, Marissa interrupted, her voice dropping like a blade. Because I was the woman you hit, Officer Miller. The words landed like a physical blow. Miller froze, his face going pale as the reality sank in. For a moment, he said nothing, his mouth opening and closing as he scrambled for words that wouldn't come. Marissa didn't look away. Surprised? Miller's voice was barely audible. I didn't, you didn't know. Marissa finished for him, her tone cold. Or you didn't care. The silence stretched between them, heavy and suffocating. I've reviewed the footage, Marissa said finally, her voice measured. And I've reviewed your record. This time, Officer Miller, there's no hiding. No excuses. Miller sat frozen, his confidence shattered. He could see it now, the pieces of his life beginning to break apart, and there was nothing he could do to stop it. Marissa leaned forward slightly, her gaze unwavering. You wanted to know what accountability looks like. She paused, letting the tension settle like a stone. You're about to find out. The day was heavy with anticipation, the kind of tension that settled deep in the bones. Inside the precinct, silence felt unnatural. Phones rang quietly, muffled conversations echoed faintly, and officers avoided eye contact as they went about their routines. There was a sense of inevitability in the air, like a storm slowly building but not yet breaking. Everyone felt it, whether they knew why or not. In the conference room, Marissa Bennett sat at the head of the table. She was calm, her expression unreadable as always, but the air around her seemed charged. The walls hummed with a quiet energy, as though the building itself knew what was about to happen. Across the table sat the captains, detectives, and senior officers, their faces a mix of curiosity and unease. This wasn't a routine meeting, and everyone could feel it. The empty seat near the far end didn't go unnoticed. The door creaked open, breaking the uneasy quiet. Travis Miller stepped inside, his shoulders squared as if the weight of his arrogance could still shield him. The faint smugness that always colored his presence had dimmed, but it wasn't gone. Not yet. His eyes flicked to Marissa, searching for answers she refused to give. Have a seat, Officer Miller, she said, her tone even. Miller's jaw flexed, but he complied, lowering himself into the chair across the room. He knew she had called this meeting for him, every cell in his body screamed it. His pulse thudded steadily in his ears as he glanced around, feeling the weight of every pair of eyes in the room. Marissa let the silence stretch, purposeful and precise. When she finally spoke, her voice was low but carried the force of a sledgehammer. Yesterday, I said there would be accountability. The room shifted. People sat straighter, breaths held without realizing. She slid a folder across the table. Its movement felt louder than it should have, amplified by the silence. Miller's name was typed in bold across the tab. Inside this folder are records of Officer Miller's misconduct, use of force complaints, witness statements, incidents swept under the rug. She spoke clearly, her words sharp and deliberate. Too many complaints. Too many second chances. Too much silence. Miller's face hardened. What is this, a witch hunt? No, Officer Miller, Marissa replied, her eyes narrowing. It's accountability. His fists clenched under the table. I've been doing this job 10 years. You don't know what it's like out there. You sit behind a desk, Marissa's voice cut through his like a blade. Don't insult me. The room went still again. Miller froze, the words he was about to say caught in his throat. Marissa leaned forward slightly, her gaze never wavering. I was out there, she continued. I worked this job for years, years of proving myself over and over again to men just like you. And don't you dare tell me I don't understand, because I know exactly who you are, Officer Miller. I've seen it. I've lived it. Miller shifted in his seat, suddenly uncomfortable. I don't know what you're talking about. Marissa's expression didn't change. She reached for the remote on the table and pressed a button. The wall-mounted screen behind her flickered to life. The footage played, clear, undeniable. The gym. The confrontation. Miller's finger jabbing into her space. The strike. Marissa staggering back, the stunned faces of the gym patrons frozen in time. Miller's face drained of color as the truth stared back at him. He couldn't deny it. He couldn't twist it. It was all there, raw and unfiltered. The room watched in silence, their expressions turning from curiosity to disbelief, then to quiet, simmering anger. When the video ended, Marissa turned back to Miller. What you see here is a man who let his ego speak louder than his oath to serve and protect. A man who used his authority as a weapon, not a responsibility. Miller's voice was hoarse. I didn't know, you didn't know what? Marissa demanded, her voice rising for the first time. That I was the chief of police. Would it have changed how you acted? Would it have mattered? Miller swallowed hard, the weight of the moment crashing down on him. Marissa cut him off. You didn't see me as a person. You didn't care who I was because to you, I wasn't worth respecting. That's what this is about. It's not just about me, it's about everyone you've treated this way. Every person who didn't have a badge to protect them or a title to hold you accountable. Miller's shoulders slumped. He looked around the room, but there was no support to be found. The captains and detectives stared at him with expressions that ranged from disappointment to outright disgust. Marissa pushed the folder closer to him. This ends today. What are you going to do? Miller asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Marissa stood, her presence towering despite her calm demeanor. What I'm going to do, she said, is hold you accountable. Effective immediately, you are suspended pending a full investigation into your conduct. Your badge and weapon will be surrendered. And this time, Officer Miller, you won't get to hide behind silence. Miller shot to his feet, his voice trembling with anger and desperation. You can't, this isn't fair. I've given everything to this job. Marissa's gaze was icy. You gave this job a stain it doesn't deserve. You dishonored the badge you wear. The door opened, and 2 internal affairs officers stepped inside, their presence final and undeniable. Miller turned to them, his bravado cracking as reality hit. This is ridiculous. I'll fight this. Marissa didn't flinch. You're welcome to try. The IA officers flanked Miller, one holding out a hand for his badge. Slowly, Miller reached for his chest, his movements heavy and reluctant. He unpinned the badge and placed it in the officer's hand. The weight of it leaving his chest seemed to take a piece of him with it. Let's go, one of the IA officers said quietly. Miller turned back to Marissa, his face a mix of anger and something else, something almost like regret. You'll ruin this department, he spat. No, Marissa said softly. I'll save it. The room watched as Miller was escorted out, his footsteps echoing down the hallway like a death knell. When the door closed behind him, the silence that followed was thick, suffocating. Marissa exhaled slowly, steadying herself. She turned back to the room, her gaze sweeping over the remaining officers. This is what accountability looks like, she said. If you can't handle it, if you can't respect the oath you took, then you don't belong here. I will not tolerate corruption, abuse, or disrespect in this department. She paused, letting her words sink in. We can do better. And we will. No one said a word. They didn't need to. The message was clear. As Marissa left the conference room, the tension hung heavy in the air, but something else lingered, too, a flicker of hope, like a spark waiting to ignite. For years, the department had been weighed down by silence, by fear, by unchecked power. But now, the silence had been shattered. And for Travis Miller, the reckoning had only just begun. The precinct's main corridor buzzed with subdued whispers as Officer Travis Miller's departure sent ripples through the building. People had seen him escorted out, his badge surrendered, his career hanging by a thread, and the reality of what had just happened was sinking in. For years, Miller had been a fixture, someone who walked with untouchable authority. Now, that image was shattered, and the silence he left behind was filled with a mix of shock, vindication, and disbelief. In her office, Marissa Bennett stood by the window, staring out at the city below. The skyline stretched endlessly, a mix of glass, steel, and concrete that shimmered beneath the afternoon sun. Her reflection stared back at her, composed, unflinching, but inside, a storm raged. What had just happened was monumental, but it wasn't over. It wouldn't be over until the rot that festered beneath the surface was cut out completely. A soft knock on the door broke her thoughts. Come in, she said, turning. Alyssa Torres entered quietly, her usual calm veneer slightly cracked. She carried a tablet in one hand, and her dark eyes flickered with hesitation. "Chief, I thought you'd want to see this." Marissa gestured for her to sit. "What is it?" Alyssa handed her the tablet, biting her lip. "The video, it's spreading." Marissa froze. "What video?" "The gym footage," Alyssa said softly. "Someone leaked it. It's all over social media, news outlets are already picking it up. People are talking, Chief. About you, about him. About everything." Marissa swiped the screen, and there it was, the clip of Miller's assault, captured in brutal clarity. The video played silently, but the visuals said enough. The finger pointing. The aggression. The punch. And then the moment Marissa had stood back up, bloodied but unwavering, meeting Miller's gaze with quiet fury. Her jaw tightened as she set the tablet down. "How bad is it?" Alyssa hesitated. "It depends on how you look at it. People are angry, but not at you. They're angry at the system, at the silence. You're already being called a hero in some places." Marissa let out a small, humorless laugh. "A hero. You stood up," Alyssa said softly. "When most people can't." Marissa shook her head, her voice low. "It shouldn't take someone with my title to make a stand. It shouldn't take this much." Alyssa watched her carefully, choosing her next words with precision. "Maybe not. But it matters that you did." Marissa exhaled, her shoulders relaxing slightly. "And Miller?" "He's talking," Alyssa admitted. "To IA. To anyone who will listen. He's saying this is personal. That you're targeting him because of what happened." Marissa's expression darkened. "Because I held him accountable for his actions." Alyssa nodded. "That's his angle. But no one's buying it. Not after the video." Marissa leaned against the desk, crossing her arms. "He's trying to turn himself into the victim. That's not going to work." Alyssa's phone buzzed in her pocket, and she glanced at it briefly. "There's more." "What now?" "It's not just about Miller anymore," Alyssa said, carefully handing Marissa another document. "Other complaints are surfacing. People, citizens, even other officers, they're coming forward. About him. About others." Marissa's eyes scanned the paper as the weight of the words settled over her. Names she recognized. Incidents that had been ignored or dismissed. The dam was breaking, and everything hidden beneath the surface was finally coming to light. "This is what accountability does," Marissa murmured, more to herself than to Alyssa. "It forces the truth out." Down the hall, Travis Miller sat slumped in a chair outside the Internal Affairs office, his face pale and drawn. He hadn't spoken since the two officers had escorted him there, his usual bravado crumbling with every step. The walls felt too close, the silence too loud. For the first time, he was the one being watched. Detective Marcus Green walked toward him, his expression unreadable. Miller looked up, his jaw clenching as he straightened slightly. "Marcus," he said, trying to sound steady. "You know this is blown out of proportion, right? I'm the bad guy now. After all these years." Marcus regarded him for a long moment, his gaze sharp and unwavering. "You think this is about one incident?" Miller's lips tightened. "She's making this personal." No," Marcus interrupted, his voice low but cutting. "You made it personal. Every time you looked at someone and saw less than yourself. Every time you crossed a line and hid behind your badge. And now you're surprised it's caught up to you." Miller's voice cracked as his temper flared. "You don't understand what it's like out there. We don't have the luxury of what?" Marcus shot back, his voice rising slightly. "Of respect? Of restraint? Don't talk to me about what it's like out there, Miller. I've been there. I've seen it. I've been on calls where officers like you make everything worse because you think your badge gives you the right to do whatever you want. Miller stared at him, speechless. You let the power go to your head, Marcus continued, his tone softer now, though no less firm. You stopped seeing people for who they are. And now, you're paying for it. That's not anyone's fault but your own. Miller looked away, his hands trembling slightly. I didn't mean for it to get this far. Marcus shook his head, a bitter smile tugging at the corner of his mouth. Intent doesn't erase the damage, Miller. It never has. In the briefing room later that afternoon, officers and detectives sat gathered for a meeting that felt different from any other. The room buzzed with murmurs, the weight of recent events pressing down on everyone present. When Marissa entered, the voices died down immediately. She stepped to the front of the room, her expression serious but calm. I know the last few days have been difficult, she began. Difficult for this department, and difficult for all of you. She paused, scanning the room. What happened with Officer Miller is just one example of a larger problem, one that too many of us have ignored for too long. But ignoring it doesn't make it go away. Silence doesn't fix what's broken. Accountability does. A few officers shifted uncomfortably in their seats. Others nodded faintly. Let me be clear, Marissa continued, her voice carrying the weight of her words. Accountability is not an attack. It's not punishment for doing your job. It's a promise, to this city and to ourselves, that we will do better. That we can do better. She glanced around the room again. If you wear this badge, it means something. It should stand for something. Integrity. Respect. Service. And if that's not what it means to you, then you don't belong here. The room was silent. Some officers looked down at their hands, others stared straight ahead. Marissa let the moment settle before she spoke again. This is not about tearing this department apart. It's about rebuilding it, piece by piece, into something we can all be proud of. As the meeting ended, officers filtered out slowly, their expressions thoughtful and subdued. For some, Marissa's words had struck a nerve. For others, they planted a seed, one that would take time to grow. In her office, Marissa sank into her chair, exhaustion weighing heavily on her shoulders. The road ahead wouldn't be easy. She knew that. Change never was. But for the first time in years, she felt something that had been missing for far too long, hope. Hope that the silence was finally breaking. Hope that the reckoning would lead to something better. And as the sun began to set, casting golden light across the city, Marissa Bennett knew one thing for certain, there was no going back now. The weight of the day sat heavy on the precinct like a cloud that refused to lift. Conversations were hushed, the usual noise and banter replaced by quiet exchanges and loaded glances. The news of Travis Miller's suspension had spread beyond the walls of the department, catching fire across the city. Headlines screamed about abuse of power, about a corrupt officer brought down by accountability, and about the woman, the chief, who had demanded it. But the fallout wasn't contained to the news. Inside the department, officers wrestled with their own emotions. Some bristled with resentment, seeing Miller's suspension as an attack on the badge they wore. Others were quiet, unsettled, unsure of where they stood. And then there were those who had watched Miller's behavior for years, who had whispered among themselves but never spoken out loud. For them, the silence now felt like complicity. Marissa Bennett knew this silence. She'd lived in it, worked through it. It was the silence of reckoning, the moment before people decided whether to step forward or to shrink back. And while Miller's departure was the start of something bigger, she also knew it was far from over. In her office, the hum of her phone vibrating against the desk broke the quiet. Marissa glanced at it, Marcus Green. She answered, her voice calm despite her exhaustion. Marcus. Chief, Marcus said, his voice steady but edged with something heavier. You should come down to the break room. There's something you'll want to hear. Marissa frowned, her brow furrowing. What is it? It's better you see for yourself, Marcus replied. Trust me. Marissa exhaled softly. I'll be right there. She stood, smoothing her suit jacket as she left her office, her heels clicking against the tile with quiet authority. Officers moved aside as she passed, their eyes flickering toward her and then quickly away. By the time she reached the break room, her presence was already expected. Inside, Marcus stood near the doorway, his arms crossed as he watched the small television mounted on the wall. A handful of officers lingered in the room, their backs stiff, their gazes glued to the screen. Marissa followed their line of sight. The news was playing live footage of protests, small groups gathering across the city, holding signs that read, "Justice for all," and "No badge above the law." Interviews with community members flashed across the screen, voices filled with anger, frustration, and a hard-earned weariness. "They're rallying around you," Marcus said quietly, his voice almost drowned out by the sound of the news anchor. Marissa watched a young woman on the screen holding a sign that read, "Finally, accountability." The woman's voice trembled with emotion as she spoke. "This isn't just about what happened at the gym. This is about all the time someone like him got away with it because people like us were too afraid to speak up. She's showing us it doesn't have to be like that anymore." The scene cut to another man, older, his face lined with age and hardship. He shook his head as he looked at the camera. "It shouldn't take a police chief to get justice. But if that's what it takes, I'll stand behind her." Marissa's jaw tightened as the weight of their words hit her. The protests weren't just about Miller. They were about something bigger, something the city had been carrying for years. Her actions had become a symbol, whether she wanted them to or not. "This is only going to get louder," Marcus said, breaking her thoughts. "And you know as well as I do, not everyone's going to take it well." Marissa turned to him, her expression steady. "I didn't take this job to make friends, Marcus. I took it to make a difference." "And you're doing that," Marcus replied, his voice firm. "But it's also going to push people into corners. Some are going to fight back." "Let them," she said simply. "I'm not afraid of a fight." Across town, Travis Miller sat in a small, sterile office, his shoulders hunched and his face drawn. The lights buzzed overhead, adding to the tension in the room. Across from him sat two internal affairs officers, their faces unreadable as they watched him. Miller's eyes were bloodshot, his hands restless as they gripped the edge of the table. "This is ridiculous," he muttered, his voice raw. "Everything I've done, everything I've given to this department, and this is what I get." One of the IA officers, a tall woman with sharp features, leaned forward slightly. "Officer Miller, this investigation isn't about loyalty. It's about your actions. Your record speaks for itself." "My record?" Miller snapped, his voice rising. "You don't know what it's like out there. You sit behind desks and read reports, but you don't see the chaos we deal with every day." The woman didn't flinch. "That doesn't justify what you did." Miller's voice cracked. "I didn't mean for it to happen. I didn't know who she was." "That's not the point," the other officer interjected, his tone sharp. "It shouldn't matter who she was. It shouldn't matter who anyone is. You crossed a line, Miller, and this department can't protect you anymore." Miller's shoulders slumped, the anger draining from his face as the truth hit him. There was no getting out of this. No excuses left to hide behind. The badge that had shielded him for years was gone, and all that was left was the man he'd become, angry, bitter, and alone. I just wanted respect," he whispered, his voice barely audible. The woman across from him shook her head, her expression softening slightly. "Respect isn't something you take, Officer Miller. It's something you earn." At the precinct, Marissa walked through the hallways, her mind a whirlwind of thoughts. The weight of leadership pressed against her, heavier now than ever. She knew the protests would grow. She knew the backlash would come. And she knew that not everyone in the department stood with her. As she rounded the corner, she found Marcus waiting for her, his expression unreadable. "Marcus? You've got another problem," he said quietly. "Word spreading that some of Miller's guys aren't happy about what happened. They're starting to talk, to each other, to anyone who will listen. They think this is a witch hunt. That you're going too far." Marissa's eyes narrowed. "I'm doing what needs to be done." "I know," Marcus said, his tone calm but firm. "But you need to be ready. This isn't over." Marissa nodded slowly, the resolve in her chest hardening like stone. "It won't be over until this department becomes something better. If they want to fight that, let them. I'll be ready." Marcus studied her for a long moment before speaking again. "You're putting yourself in the crosshairs, Chief. People are already looking for a reason to tear you down." Marissa's gaze was steady as she met his eyes. "Let them try." She turned and continued down the hallway, her steps measured and deliberate. Every move she made, every decision she took, carried consequences. She knew that. But if the cost of accountability was standing alone, then so be it. Outside, the city grew louder, the protests swelling, the tension rising. Travis Miller's fall had sparked something larger than any one man. And as Marissa looked out over the streets from her office window, she knew the fight wasn't just for justice. It was for change. Real change. But change, she knew, came with a price. And she was willing to pay it. The air in the city had shifted. The protests, which began as whispers of frustration, had become roars of collective demand, an undeniable call for justice. Outside the precinct, voices echoed through the streets, resolute, determined, and unwilling to be silenced. Inside, the atmosphere was heavy, but not with fear, with change. Officers moved with quiet contemplation, some wrestling with unease, others stepping into their roles with renewed purpose. The reckoning Marissa Bennett had set into motion was no longer about one man or one moment. It was about something bigger, something long overdue. Marissa stood in her office, looking out the window as the evening sky darkened, streaked with orange and purple. The faint sounds of the crowd outside reached her ears, a reminder of the weight she carried. A knock on her door broke her thoughts. "Come in," she said softly. Marcus Green stepped inside, his usual calm presence filling the room. He carried a folder in his hand, his expression thoughtful. "Chief," he said, setting the folder on her desk. "Miller's hearing is scheduled. IA's findings are complete." Marissa nodded, her expression unreadable. "And?" "He's done," Marcus replied simply. "The evidence is too strong. They're recommending termination. He'll never wear a badge again." A silence settled between them as Marissa absorbed his words. It was what she'd fought for, what accountability demanded, but it didn't bring her satisfaction, only a quiet, heavy closure. "What about the others?" she asked finally. Marcus hesitated before answering. "Complaints have come in against a few other officers, nothing as blatant as Miller, but it's enough to reopen investigations. People are talking now, Chief. They're not afraid anymore." Marissa met his gaze. "That's what accountability looks like." Marcus nodded slowly. "It's not just the department, though. The community's watching. What you did, it gave people hope, but it also put you in the spotlight. They'll expect you to keep going." "And I will," Marissa said firmly, her voice steady. "This isn't a one-time victory, Marcus. It's a first step. If we're going to rebuild trust, we can't stop here." Marcus studied her for a moment, his expression softening with respect. "You know, a lot of people didn't think you'd make it this far." Marissa allowed herself a small smile. "Then they didn't know me." Travis Miller sat alone in his empty apartment, the silence pressing down on him like a weight he couldn't shake. The walls felt smaller now, the space suffocating. In his hands was a letter, the official notice of his termination. The words blurred as he stared at them, but there was no escaping their meaning. For the first time in years, Miller was forced to look in the mirror and see himself for who he really was. The badge that had once made him feel untouchable was gone. The power he'd clung to had slipped through his fingers. And now, all that was left was the man behind it, a man who had spent years taking shortcuts, hiding behind authority, and ignoring the consequences of his actions. He set the letter down, his hands trembling. He wanted to blame someone, Marissa, the system, anyone but himself, but deep down, he knew the truth. This wasn't about one moment. It was about years of choices that had finally caught up to him. The knock at his door startled him. He hesitated before answering it, his heart pounding in his chest. When he opened it, he froze. Standing there was Detective Marcus Green, holding a folder under his arm. "Miller," he said evenly, his gaze calm. "What do you want?" Miller muttered, his voice hollow. Marcus stepped inside, looking around the sparse apartment before turning back to Miller. "I'm not here to gloat. I'm here because you have a choice to make." Miller frowned. "What are you talking about?" Marcus handed him the folder. "These are the names of people who came forward because of what happened. People you hurt. People who trusted you to do your job and instead got the worst of you. You want to fix this? Start by listening to them. Start by admitting what you did." Miller stared at the folder as though it might burn his hands. "Why would I do that?" "Because you've lost everything," Marcus replied, his voice sharp but not unkind. "And the only way you're going to find yourself again is by facing the truth. You might never earn back the respect you had, but you can try to be better. It's up to you." Miller didn't answer, but for the first time, his expression cracked. He looked down at the folder, his breathing shallow. Marcus left without another word, leaving him alone to face the silence. A week later, the protests had quieted, but the city felt different. There was a cautious hope in the air, a sense that something had shifted. At the community center, a gathering was underway, members of the community sitting side by side with police officers, talking, listening, sharing their experiences. Marissa stood near the back of the room, watching as conversations unfolded. People who had once seen the police as adversaries were speaking to them now, not with trust, not yet, but with something close to it. It was a fragile bridge, but it was there. "Quite a sight, isn't it?" Marcus said, joining her. Marissa nodded. "It's a start. People are going to remember what you did here," Marcus said softly. "You could have buried that footage. You could have let it go. But you didn't." "Because it wasn't about me," Marissa replied. "It was about all the people who didn't have a voice. The ones who deserved justice but never got it." Marcus smiled faintly. "Well, you gave them something to believe in." Marissa looked at the room again, her heart full. "It's not about believing in me. It's about believing that change is possible. That accountability isn't a threat, it's a promise." As the evening sun dipped below the horizon, Marissa returned to her office. She sat at her desk, the city's hum drifting in through the window. Her phone buzzed with a notification. She picked it up and saw a news headline, "Chief of Police Sparks Change, a City Stands Behind Accountability." She set the phone down and leaned back in her chair, letting herself breathe. The fight wasn't over. There would always be challenges, always resistance, but for the first time in a long time, Marissa felt that she wasn't alone. The silence she had broken was now filled with voices, demanding, questioning, changing. And that, she knew, was just the beginning. To all of you listening, this story is more than just about one officer, one victim, or one department. It's about a fight for accountability, for justice, and for change. It's about asking ourselves who we are when no one is watching, and who we choose to be when someone finally speaks up. Have you ever faced a moment where you had to stand up, even when it felt like the world was against you? Let us know in the comments, your voice matters, and your story could inspire someone else. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to hit that subscribe button and join us here at Tales of Twist. We're just getting started, and you won't want to miss what's coming next. Thank you for listening, and remember, the truth always finds a way.